Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram. Don't forget to support me on Locals, as well as buy me a coffee and subscribe star. And per usual, I will, at the end of the show, look at the chats. Super chats will be read first. Other chats will be read as time permits or as relevant to the discussion. This will be a new type of content. So this is not necessarily a part of the casual stream or the roundtables. And this will be a sort of self-contained series of 3 parts for the 3 parts of The Machine Stops. And after a predetermined period of time, they'll only be available for those who subscribe to me on Locals. So they'll be uploaded for free. You can watch them. And then after a predetermined amount of time, they'll then be behind the Locals subscription wall. And that way, that's something for my subscribers on Locals. So they actually get some unique content that nobody else can get. So The Machine Stops. This is one of, I think, the most interesting and prescient works on technology and where it was going and where we are now. This was, believe it or not, written in 1909. So think about that. A couple of interesting things is from the BBC, Will Gompertz wrote, "The Machine Stops is not simply prescient. It is jaw-droppingly, gobsmackingly, breathtakingly, accurately literate description of lockdown life in 2020. Yeah, that's true. It's more than that. It's also a very good description of the Great Reset, living in a pod and eating synthetic foods. And we'll get to all that when we actually break down the episode. What's interesting is E.M. Forster wasn't actually really known for writing about science fiction or futurism or anything like that. So it's kind of really interesting that this work has this flair to it and is so strikingly accurate to what we deal with today. 2 pieces of technology that we take for granted, but that he didn't really have the words that we use now. It'd be a sort of instant messaging like emails or maybe even like social media. And then a machine that can project visual images, which he calls the cinematopho. So, in homage to Forster, you're watching me on the cinematopho. So remember that, everybody. So as a brief overview, there will be spoilers. So if you haven't read The Machine Stops, maybe you should pause it here and then read The Machine Stops. But for those who either have read it or don't care, The Machine Stops is divided into broadly 3 chapters. And there's like the main themes of each chapter. So the first chapter is basically just introducing you to life in the machine. And then 2 characters, Vashti and her son Kuno. And the second chapter is where her son Kuno seeks to leave the machine and visit the world outside. And then the third chapter, the big idea is that, well, it's in the title, The Machine Stops. He then describes how it slows down, breaks down, and then completely disintegrates. So those are the 3 big ideas located in each chapter. Now, throughout, there are underlying ideas. One underlying set of ideas is the importance of, one, that the machine makes you dependent on it, so you become weak and defenseless. And that in order to escape the machine, if it can be escaped, you need to practice diet and exercise. The other thing is that the machine removes creative ideas. People inside the machine don't really have any new ideas anymore. And there's a lot of that in this first chapter, which I'll get to. And then the other point is, of course, the machine itself, which is almost a third character, in addition to Vashti and Kuno, which just imposes itself on everyone. People don't remember where it came from. They don't really remember who created it. It's been around so long. It's just this fixture. It has this almost like divine quality to it from the point of view of those who live inside of it. All right. We have Minoan, Big Brain Content, Paul Moosefoot, Evidence Violates Community Guidelines, More Outrage, Profit, Walganon, all in the chat. Well, hello, everyone. I hope you're here for a really good episode tonight. So I took some notes on the book, and what I'm going to do is sort of look at some what I think are key paragraphs that illustrate something about the themes in the book, and then comment on that. So this is the very first paragraph. Imagine, if you can, a small room, hexagonal in shape like the cell of a bee. It is lighted neither by window nor by lamp. yet it is filled with a soft radiance. There are no apertures for ventilation, yet the air is fresh. There is no musical instruments, and yet as the moment that any meditation opens, this book is throbbing with melodious sounds. An armchair is in the center. By its side, a reading desk that is all furnished, all the furniture, and in the armchair there sits a swaddled lump of flesh, a woman about 5 feet high with a face as white as fungus. It is to her that this little room belongs. Now, it's amazing how painfully accurate this is to the present day. I mean, first of all, okay, living in a cell, we could speak of Cubeville, right? That's where people work. But now with like the urban setting and also this idea of living in a pod with the Great Reset, Cubeville is where you live, not just where you work. So we're already seeing this. All light is artificial, so the continual artificial light that we're all accustomed to is already predicted here, without any access to real light from the outside of the sun. The idea that music, we have now. Well, we had first cassette tapes and then CDs, and now we have streaming services where we can get music on demand. Nothing. Maybe I think the phonograph might have been invented by this point, but nothing like this level of casual access was available to anyone at that time. And he's basically describing, some sort of like SoundCloud subscription or something. It's crazy. Also, not having any physical exertions from living in the real world and not being exposed to the sun, this woman is completely out of shape and is white as a ghost, or as he says, fungus. And, this is where we kind of talk about, pod people, or, all these other slurs are for people that are very comfortable living inside the machine, but not outside of it. Just so chillingly accurate to where we live now. It's really crazy. And this, the main theme here is that the machine enfeebles, makes us weak and dependent upon it, which is a theme I talk about a lot on this channel, and a theme that we will see revisited throughout the rest of this. Now we have another paragraph. I believe that you pray to it when you are unhappy. Men made it. Do not forget that. Great men, but men. The machine is much, but it is not everything. I see something like you in this plate, but I do not see you. I hear something like you through this telephone, but I do not hear you. That is why I want you to come, pay me a visit, so that we can meet face to face and talk about the hopes that are in my mind. This so much describes modern interactions on the internet or through modern telecommunications. We don't interact with people directly. We interact with something that looks like a person, that, on the other end is a person, but is mediated through this deracinated platform. And we're separated from each other. It's sort of like almost dealing with a ghost, right? When you can't touch a ghost, you can't hug a ghost, you can't smell a ghost. All of those things, it's completely disembodied, which is the sort of ghost-like quality. Also, I guess what I should have started with is a brief outline of Chapter 1. So the brief outline of Chapter 1 is you're introduced to Vashti, who is the woman sitting in the chair, who's completely dependent on the machine and is a sad human specimen. Her son, Kuno, lives in the northern hemisphere. She lives in the southern hemisphere of the earth. And he's thinking ideas, which we'll later get to, are him trying to escape the machine. But what's important is he doesn't want to just talk to his mother through this medium. He wants to see her face to face. So there's this kind of brewing discontent where her son isn't just satisfied with living in the machine and dealing with the machine through all these mediated human experiences. Now, within the machine, it's limited. There's not a lot of real physical interaction that you can have in the machine. But in order to begin his exodus from the machine, he starts with a face-to-face meeting with his mother. And then the rest of Chapter 1 is her deciding whether she wants to go or not, and eventually deciding to go. And that's more or less the overview of Chapter 1. Other important ideas. In the airship, he broke off, and she fancied that he looked sad. She could not be sure, for the machine did not transmit nuances of expression. It only gave a general idea of people. An idea that was good enough for all practical purposes, Vashti thought. The imponderable bloom, declared by a discredited philosophy to be the actual essence of intercourse, was rightly ignored by the machine, just as the imponderable bloom of the grape was ignored by the manufacturers of artificial fruit. Something good enough had long since been accepted by our race. Well, okay, there's a lot to unpack here. So the first thing is, one of the things that I've certainly realized online, and then I think a lot of other people have realized online, is precisely this point, is that the machine does not transmit nuances of expression. How many times have we been online in chats and on Discord or whatever and gotten into arguments with people that we weren't even intending to argue with them? Right? In a real life face-to-face conversation, if somebody's getting upset, you can read the body language, you can hear the tone of their speech. There's all sorts of cues you can pick up on to de-escalate what would otherwise become a confrontation. But online, especially if there's no face, then it's completely lost. And so it leads to a lot of really bizarre social interactions that would never occur in a face-to-face situation. And that's, again, a part of separating us from ourselves. We're not allowed to interact or be with other people. And it creates this distance. The other thing is, eating synthetic food. One, that's something that later Ellul will talk about in On Technique, which was published in the 50s, again, long after Forrester's work. And part of the problem with this is that the machine is creating this new simulated life, simulated conversation, simulated people, simulated food, whereby it's dependent wholly upon itself, which is what Baudrillard would call hyperreality. It only exists to point back to itself. And anything that might point to something beyond itself there's a synthetic alternative to, and it's just good enough. And you don't have to go any more than that. And in many regards, we're already there. Then she, Vashti, generated the light, and the sight of her room, flooded with radiance and studded with electric buttons, revived her. There were buttons and switches everywhere, buttons to call for food, for music, for clothing. There was the hot bath button, by pressure of which a basin of imitation marble rose out of the floor, filled with the brim with a warm deodorized liquid. This was the cold bath button. This was the button that produced literature, and there were, of course, the buttons by which she communicated with her friends. The room, though it contained nothing, was in touch with all that she cared for in the world. This kind of life we finally started to see during the COVID lockdowns, where people were, instead of going out to eat, did DoorDash. Instead of meeting friends in real life, talk to them online. This is a complete pod person who can't even walk out the front door. And we're surrounded by convenience and buttons or buzzers or switches or typing pads in order to interface with the machine so that we can interface with each other through the machine. And ultimately, convenience is what keeps people in. And actually, in the first place, what seduced them in is convenience. The bed was not to her liking. It was too large, and she had a feeling for a small bed. Complaint was useless, for beds were of the same dimension all over the world. And to have had an alternative size would have involved vast alterations in the machine. Vashti isolated herself. It was necessary, for neither day nor night existed under the ground, and reviewed all that had happened since he had summoned the bed last. Ideas? Scarcely any. Event was Kuno's invitation and event. Okay, 2 points here. Ideas. I'll get to that a little bit later. There's a lot that can be said about ideas in this first chapter. The other thing is the machine demands uniformity and homogeneity. We see this with a work that was published, I think, slightly before this, which was Thorsten Veblen's The Machine Process, and where he talks about the machine process and this idea that the machine itself needs to be completely regulated, completely orderly, without any of the vicissitudes of nature that we find with like the changing of the seasons and the weather and things like that. And so he doesn't want the machine process itself resists any of that. The only changes that are allowed for are those that are interstitial adjustments to any part of the machine. So this move to homogeneity that we've seen in the Western world over the last 100 years is not so much, as many on the right would consider, a socialist conspiracy, even though many socialists throughout history have tried to hitch their wagon to this process and argue that they're scientific for doing so. It's actually a necessary result of the scientific worldview itself. And again, for him to have this already fully formed in 1909 is an incredible thing for me to think about. Of course, she knew all about the communication system. There was nothing mysterious in it. She would summon a car and it would fly with her down the tunnel until it reached the lift that communicated with the airship station. The system had been in use for many, many years, long before the universal establishment of the machine. And of course, she had studied the civilization that had immediately preceded her own. The civilization that had mistaken the functions of the system and had used it for bringing people to things instead of bringing things to people. These funny old days when men went out for a change of air instead of changing the air in their rooms. And yet she was frightened of the tunnel. She had not seen it since her last child was born. It curved, but not quite as she remembered. It was brilliant, but not quite as brilliant as the lecturer had suggested. Vashti was seized with the terrors of direct experience. She shrank back into the room, and the walls closed up again. This is, I think, really the key statement in this whole paragraph. The civilization that had mistaken the functions of the system and had used it for bringing people to things instead of bringing things to people. Right? Because ultimately it's more orderly, more homogeneous, more streamlined, because people can't be accounted for, right? We have this X factor, will, choice, whereas this process of mechanization is completely orderly. And of course, the machine wants completely orderliness. So it's to the interest of the machine process to make people as much like a part of the machine as possible. We also see with Vashti what Ivan Illich talks about with the idea of system. We are now a part of the system, not the system serving us. This is a concern also found in Aldous Huxley's 1946 preface to Brave New World, where he quotes Christ saying, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. We're seeing a very advanced stage of this inversion of everything. And again, this is like almost, a little less than 20 years before Brave New World was published, and long before Illich writes about the 3 ages of tools. So again, very, very prescient to see how the machine would do this. Also, when you become so dependent on the machine as Vashti is, even walking out your front door becomes something that people don't want to do. One of the things that's been commented on lately is how people don't socialize, people don't go outside and talk to each other, even before COVID, even before the pandemic, but especially after. I mean, a big part of that is people just lost the ability to leave, right? They're so dependent on the machine. They're so comfortable in their pods already that there's the Great Reset is kind of formalizing a reality that already exists. But she thought of Kuno as a baby, his birth, his removal to the public nurseries, her own visit to him there, his visit to her visits, which stopped when the machine had assigned him a room on the other side of the earth. Parents' duties of, said the book of the machine, ceases at the moment of birth, P422327483. Well, we could talk about this is like hyper boomer, super boomer, right? Parental duties end at 18 in American boomerdom, but here it's even further. It's at birth. So what we can argue then is this boomer mentality of kicking their kids out of the home at 18 is actually a result of this machine thinking and process, which logically concluded would mean that you don't have any attachment to your children even at birth or after birth, which is what we see finally consummated with the machine here. Again, unbelievable predictability. Of course, it was perfectly easy. The car approached, and in it she found armchairs exactly like her own. When she signaled it stopped and she tottered into the lift. One passenger was in the lift, the first fellow creature she had seen face to face for months. Few traveled in these days, for thanks to the advances of science, the earth was exactly alike all over. Rapid intercourse from which the previous civilization had hoped so much had ended by defeating itself. What was the good of going to Peking when it was just like Shrewsbury? Why return to Shrewsbury when it would all be Peking? Men seldom moved their bodies. All unrest was concentrated in the soul. Right? This is the sort of kind of homogenization that was often discussed with regards to globalism and the McDonaldification of the world. Right? As if this is a result of market forces in order to create a homogenous world market for McDonald's or something, and which is the McDonald's everywhere, so it's all the same. Obviously, market forces were at work, but one could argue market forces have always existed, and we haven't got to this point before. What's different? Oh, the machine. And again, back to what I said with Thorsten Veblen, it needs to be uniform everywhere and at all times. And technique seeks efficiency, as Ellul says, and it needs to interface globally because that's the most efficient way to work. And we see this complaint today all over the place. It's wherever I go, it's the same. Why would I want to travel around the world if I don't get to see local cultures, try local food, and see anything different? If it's just like where I came from. One thing that I'll mention is that when Vashti is walking to the airship, there's a man who drops a book. And he can't pick it up. He wonders why he dropped it. He even feels his arm, it says in the book. So people are physically weak. They're decrepit. They can barely get around. And again, we're seeing a lot of that now, especially with younger generations, because life in the machine enervates and enfeebles. Men tried to outrace the sun in flying machines, a mechanical Icarus. So he's sort of implicitly referring here to the Greek myth of Daedalus and Icarus. And there's a sort of similar results, but we'll wait till we get to the end of the book for that. People were almost like exactly all over the world, but the attendant of the airship, perhaps owing to her exceptional duties, had grown a little out of the common. She had often to address passengers with direct speech, and this had given her a certain roughness and originality of manner. When Vashti swerved away from the sunbeams with a cry, she behaved barbarically. She put out her hand to steady her. "How dare you!" exclaimed the passenger. "You forget yourself." The woman was confused and apologized for not having let her fall. People never touched one another. The custom had become obsolete owing to the machine. Well, one, that was satirized in the movie Demolition Man. People didn't have physical contact with each other. So there, and again, why would you, right? Because a lot of the things that humans do when they touch each other isn't very conducive for the machine. And furthermore, on a very base level, the sort of tactile feel of the human creates bonds of affection, which remove you from the machine. It makes you less fitted to be a cog, and it wants you to be that cog. And also, as the machine reproduces itself throughout the world, it separates us from each other. It creates its own impediments as well. So while it creates these impediments to our touching each other, being in fellowship with each other, it then has to, as Alul says, use technique on us socially through conditioning, propaganda, and all that stuff in order to accept this new condition. And that is all summed up in the book of the machine, which is basically the Bible of this age that Vashti clings to like a Christian would cling to a Bible. Okay, ideas. This is important. Kuno gets his ideas from nature and from people living in nature. Vashti gets her ideas from the machine echoing back to itself. So Kuno talks about the stars in the sky, Orion. So let me change my screen here and bring up the actual book itself, because there's a few other things that I didn't put down which I think are relevant to this. First of all, stars. This is so Kuno here is getting ideas from the real world because he's seen it. And she says, "I dislike seeing the horrible brown earth and the sea and the stars when it is dark. I get no ideas in an airship. I do not get them anywhere else. What kind of ideas can the air give you?" He paused for an instant. "Do you not know the 4 big stars that form an oblong and 3 stars close together in the middle of the oblong and hanging from the stars 3 other stars?" "No, I do not. I dislike the stars." "But did they give you an idea? How interesting. Tell me." "I had an idea that they were like a man. I do not understand. The 4 big stars are the man's shoulders and his knees. The 3 stars in the middle are like the belts that the men wore once, and the 3 stars hanging like a sword. Men carried swords with them to kill animals and other men. It does not strike me as a very good idea, but it is certainly original. Where did you come to it first?" "In the airship," he broke off, and she fancied that he looked sad. So what we see here is that originality is to be found in nature, right? You're dealing with the natural world, but also the past. Because when we talk about lack of originality, let's see. She studies the Brisbane School, which is some past epoch of musical history from Australia. And she says, remote and primeval as the methods of I San So in the Brisbane School, she yet felt, she said, that study of them might repay the musicians of today. They had freshness. They had, above all, ideas. That's the thing you don't have inside the machine, ideas. What have people been complaining about for the last 10 years? Why can't Hollywood come up with new ideas for films? and they just recycle and regurgitate their own trash. Because you can't have ideas inside the machine. You have to go outside. You have to go into nature or into history. And the people that get promoted to make movies for Hollywood don't do that. And even if you could, it's politically incorrect to do so. And so this dearth of creative energy that we have in our own day is the result of the machine separating us from nature and from the past, which is what we see here in The Machine Stops. We also see that Vashti gets no ideas in an airship from the mountains, from the Caucasus Mountains, from the Mediterranean Sea, Greece, and the adjoining islands. That's where chapter 1 ends. So this ideas are a huge part of this. Vashti doesn't have any ideas of her own, and she only gets ideas from engaging with the past, her own peculiar studies in music, for example, and talking to other scholars in other fields through what we would call the internet. But she doesn't get any of her own. And whenever she sees the real world, it makes her uncomfortable. She recoils and she doesn't get ideas. Whereas her son, who at first could only see the stars from the windows of the airship, gets ideas. And he then gets a dangerous idea, trying to leave the machine. And in order to announce, so to speak, this idea, he wants to talk to his mother face to face. There's a sort of visceralness to this that is a sort of implicit rebellion against the machine itself. And what's interesting is that so many people today don't have ideas. So many people are Vashti. They just are afraid to leave their homes, afraid to leave their... But more than that, they're afraid to think differently. They can't imagine that the machine hasn't always been there. You know, as I mentioned when I read earlier, Kuno said, I do believe that you pray to it when you are unhappy. Men made it. Do not forget that. Great men, but men. The machine is much, but it is not everything. I see something like you in this plate, but I do not see you. I hear something like you through this telephone, but I do not hear you. So this idea is that this is what's always struck me as bizarre, and it seems to have struck E.M. Forster as bizarre as well. That which has no precedent at all throughout human history, this strange life we find ourselves living in now, living in the machine, has no antecedent prior, and yet everybody living in it thinks it will always be until the end of time, which is insane. For almost all of history, there's been nothing like this. So why would you assume that it will always be? Well, partly there's whether the men who made the machine or the machine propagating itself, there's this important drive to say, this is all that there is, because nobody would willingly submit to this. Again, this is what Huxley says in his interview with Mike Wallace about Brave New World. People wouldn't willingly submit to this. They have to be led to believe there's no choice, because it's a radically inhuman way to live. And so they have to create this impression that the machine is godlike. We see this with transhumanism, that by interfacing with the machine, uploading your consciousness to an AI computer, the cloud, you'll be immortal. All of these crazy fantasies, which can never come to be. We see this. The other thing that we see is he makes reference to 2 ages of the earth, at least within his story. One is the literature epoch, which he describes as having deforested much of the world to make books, which could probably be referred to as his own time, the time of mass printing and early stages of industrialization. There's the, he doesn't call it this, but there's basically the age right before the machine, which is the age of growth and scientific conquest, which is, you know, the age, I guess, that we're living in now. And then he speculates if this process continues to complete homogeneity throughout the world, you end up in this age here. There's plenty of other lovely comments and ideas in here. He says, you know, the airships were never decommissioned because it would be too much of an inconvenience for the machine to do so, even though they serve no useful purpose. It's such a bureaucratic thing to do. But that's also, we see this a lot in our own time. There's a lot of things which many progressives and techno-futurists argue are redundant. Why don't we get rid of them? Well, in large part, we don't get rid of these earlier stages of the simulation because it's just not worth it. It's more effort to get rid of it than to keep it. And so you have this sort of unevenness to things, this unevenness of the machine. And so we also see that here, right? I've commented on this before with people being, outdated simulations or people getting different simulation programming. They therefore have a hard time interfacing with each other. The way the machine seems to deal with this is the idea that in the story is that everybody's just hyper isolated. It deals with this incompatibility in a sense by just leaving people completely isolated. And there's just artificial stimulation. At one point, Vashti says that she feels ill, and her son then, quote unquote, calls for a doctor, and it's a completely automated mechanical response, giving her pills and medicine. It's not a real doctor at all. It's just everything is just done by the machine for the machine, and the machine tells you very clearly, don't leave the machine. Then there's a group of humans that, at least in theory, run things called the Committee of the Machine. And it seems that the age of scientific conquest ends when the Committee of the Machine comes together, because he says specifically when there were pilots of these faster... Okay, here we go. Quick as the ship had sped westwards, the earth had rolled eastwards quicker still and had dragged back Vashti and her companions toward the sun. Science could prolong the night, but only for a little, and these high hopes of neutralizing the Earth's diurnal revolution had passed, together with hopes that were possibly higher to keep pace with the sun, hence the Icarus I mentioned earlier, or to even outstrip it, had been the aim of civilization preceding this, which he doesn't give a name, but I call it the age of scientific conquest. Racing aeroplanes had been built for this purpose, capable of enormous speeds and steered by the greatest intellectuals of the epoch. Around the globe they went, round and round, westward, round, round, amidst humanity's applause. The globe went eastward quicker still. Horrible accidents occurred, and the Committee of the Machine at the time, rising into prominence, declared the pursuit illegal, unmechanical, and punishable by homelessness. Homelessness, we'll get a description of that later. But this Committee of the Machine marks the end of the age of scientific conquest and the beginning of the machine itself. So then it's also called the Central Committee as well. They published the Book of the Machine, which is essentially the Bible of this. And so but here's the thing, right? What develops throughout the story is where we're at now, is that actually nobody's really in charge. There might be this thing called the Committee of the Machine, and they might manage, they might think they manage the machine. It might actually manage some portion of it. But as I've said before, and as Forrester is sort of satirizing here, the conceit of the technician is that the machine is so vastly complicated that no one intellectual or group of intellectuals could possibly understand it. And as we continue the story, the sort of divergence between what the Committee of the Machine says and what everybody thinks must be the case because of what they're told, and what is actually the case about the machine winding down, is this divergence. It's just far too complicated for any one person to manage. And so, unlike nature, which is, again, highly complicated, more complicated than any human can understand or any group of humans, it's self-sustaining. It doesn't need our input to work. The machine does. And so that insight, I think, is the key insight that Forrester has about why the machine can't last. The machine can't last because it's super complicated. Again, less complicated than nature of the cosmos, but still more complicated than any human intellect. But the nature of the cosmos don't need humans to constantly tweak it to make it going, whereas the machine does. And since we can't do that, it breaks. And, the title describes the ending. So that's what I have for part 1 of The Machine Stops. Parts 2 will be next week, and then part 3 will be the week after that. So Hope you enjoyed this discussion, and I hope you enjoy future discussions. Let's see what we have in the chat. Minoan, ideas. Get your ideas here. The lecture will begin on the view screen shortly. Yes. Well, no, the lecture, Minoan, will begin on the cinematopho. That's where it begins. But yeah. Let's see here. A lot of Paul Moosefoot. Been waiting all day for this one. One of my fave books. Well, that's great. I'm glad you enjoy that. Paul Moosefoot. It even implies a Chinese imperial epoch after ours. Very weird, spooky. Yeah, I know, right? He does talk about that, which is interesting. There seems to part of this is wrapped up in the idea of the yellow peril, which is an early 20th century fear of either Japan or China. As we get the villain Fu Manchu. Lovecraft also speculates about this some in some of his works. So it's a part of the zeitgeist, if you will. Let's see here. Minoan, it's a very short read. Many audiobooks are on YouTube. Yeah, exactly. It's a real light, thin volume. It's great. And Paul Moosefoot, doesn't it just blow away? Maybe except for the little details on the airships. Lol. Yeah, the airships, you got to remember, were pretty much the only major source of air travel that were available at the time. Primitive airplanes did exist, and he does refer to airplanes. But that's one of the limitations of the time from which he's writing. But the fact that he describes airplanes trying to outrace the sun seems to indicate that he's understanding that there's going to be jets. Like, I mean, he doesn't call them jets, but what would you call an airplane that's trying to outrace the sun, going faster and faster? Very interesting. Paul Moosefoot, welcome. Press that like button, chat. Yeah, exactly. Minoan, autobiographies of World War I soldiers always mention the gramophone and its impact on their lives. Yeah, the gramophone was the first time that you could listen to music without other humans being present to play it. Huge. Huge. Let's see. Charlemagne catching up on 1.25 speed. I wonder if Vashti had 1.25 speed for her lectures. Probably. Paul Moosefoot, physical interaction is legal, but people are here brainwashed not to do it. Yeah. Yeah, this actually gets to a really interesting point that Huxley brings up. Right. Huxley, in his interview with Mike Wallace, points out that the better control grid is not the one that bans things that says you can't do this, but his fear was creating a world where nobody would want to read books, even though it wasn't illegal to do so. And that's more where we've gotten to. So, and then you've got Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind. The true totalitarianism, as he says, is controlling education in such a way that you close off the avenues of inquiry so that people don't even know what they don't know, so they don't even know what they're missing. And so the censor doesn't have to do anything because it was all done at the beginning of their education. We're there now. So, yeah, a lot of these dark realities are upon us. Rucker Deepness, the thing that struck me was that when the mother went, she nearly couldn't take it. Exposure to real sunlight almost physically hurt her. I know. It's so crazy. It's I know. He knew. He just knew how people would react. Record Deepness, is The Giver just the machine stops light? Well, I've never seen The Giver. I'm not really sure that it is. Okay, The Giver. Yeah, I haven't watched it. Huh. Minoan Wally was the machine in space. Yeah, I guess for kids, G-rated, right? Evidence violates community guidelines. We want the worst burgers and the crappiest coffee available every 4 blocks worldwide. The people spoke and the market forces responded. Well, let's back it up a little bit here, right? The people didn't speak. This was what Chomsky calls manufactured consent, a term which he gets from Walter Lippmann, who wants to have a managed democracy in the 1920s, because he argues that with this modern mechanical society we're living in, we can't have true democracy. And Ellul says that as the machine is an inherently authoritarian structure, and any authentic real democracy can't exist within it. So what we're really seeing is not even people's choices, nor, because they're not really making choices, they're being led around by the nose by technique. I mean, to put it another way, they're literally having spells cast on them by wizards that they don't even know are being cast through the propaganda methods pioneered by Edward Bernays, which are part of the social technique that Ellul describes to control people. Second of all, the market forces themselves are constrained by the machine process itself, which is why once we saw the heyday of wildcat capitalism, it then turned into managed capitalism of the FDR era. It just was more efficient, right? You can't constantly have your capital stock being built up and destroyed, built up and destroyed. Those level of changes are just too radical for the machine process. It needs everything to be stable with an orderly adjustment of creation or destruction, not some anarchic market force. And so really in our modern age, the strongest force that we're dealing with is technique, the unlimited drive for efficiency. And the reason why it's the strongest force in our age is if you don't do it, your enemies will, and they'll conquer you. And that's everybody's thinking. So Paul Moosefoot, the ultimate walkable neighborhood in the machine, from one side of the pond to the other. Right. The machine would have made PLF homeless. Well, I mean, I think you can argue the machine right now is trying to make all of us dissidents homeless. Nico, the thing that's often wrong about this stuff is the idea that there is something new. In the Roman or Ottoman empires, there always said something like the machine. Okay, yes and no, right? So Mumford talks about the mega machine, which is a large organization of people conglomerated together. And we've always had mega machines in this Mumfordian sense. But what we haven't had, and I sort of hinted at this at last night's episode, is we have government which has moved from the idea of the public good to individual preferences, but in reality is moving towards the good of the machine. All of these decisions that have been made by the Democrats and the Republicans, the right and the left, over the last century, which don't seem to make sense, all make sense if you understand them to be, how do we maintain the working of the machine? How do we advance the machine? We've never been there. We've never had an entire political system fashioned to make the good of the system tools. It's always been people or some people. Now it's the tools. That's a complete inversion that we've never seen before. And furthermore, even in the mega machines of the past, it was people interacting with people. Caesar was an emperor, but Julius had people that he trusted, people who were his friends, people who were his colleagues. We don't trust people anymore. We trust the machine not to break. So there is, I guess you could say, an antitype, but it's not really what we have now. Not even close. Record deepness. I've heard a lot of airline infrastructure, especially electronics, is getting old and needs to be updated. Problem is no one can find the time to land all the planes. The loss in profit is too high. Not just the loss in profit, but also the loss in efficiency, because the people that need to fly around to make the machine work don't get to fly around. Well, can't have that. Record deepness. They did make a real committee of the machine. It's called UNESCO. Yeah, I guess it is. I guess that's true. Minoan, yeah, too hard to spell cinematepho. Fair enough. Record deepness. Guess who people don't read? Lippmann and Bernays. Yeah, Lippmann and Bernays. They for all of his flaws, that was one of the main virtues of Chomsky, introducing me to Lippmann and the idea of managed democracy. And I heard about Bernays from, I can't think of his name. There was the documentarian who wrote who did the Century of the Self, which was Adam Curtis. I heard about Edward Bernays through him. Let's see. All right, everyone. That's all I have for tonight. I hope you guys were informed by the lecture, and don't forget to tune in for the next two. Thanks for showing up. This is Todd Lewis of the Prescience of Folly podcast, signing off.